you need curiosity to constantly be on the lookout for how do we need to change the business in order to thrive a year from now or 2 years from now. So the same discussions that you would have had a couple of years ago, you would say, let's look 5 years out, 10 years out. That time frame is shortening rapidly. And curiosity, to me, is the fundamental solution to deal with that. And now, when it comes to data inspired, of course, that means not just gut feelings. What do we believe? What have I read on the blogs and in the papers? It's a curiosity that is grounded in evidence. And I think that is the successful recipe, to look into data, look into evidence and say, what is this telling us? Where are the next signals? And then use that to prepare yourself for what's coming in a couple of months these days.
Welcome to Leadership, the podcast where leadership meets real-world insights. In each episode, you can eavesdrop on exclusive conversations with top thought leaders, best-selling authors, and experts in leadership, communication, relationships, culture, and everything else that shapes your effectiveness in the workplace and in your personal life. Leadership is here for you. Now, here's our host, himself a seasoned coach and best-selling author, Dr. Roger Dean Duncan.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Leadership. In this episode, we're diving into one of the most urgent challenges facing modern organizations: how to build a culture where data doesn't just inform decisions, it transforms how people think, collaborate, and lead. My guest is Dr. Sebastian Wernicke, data scientist, TED speaker, former chief data scientist at OneLogic, and now the author of the compelling new book titled Data Inspired: Building an Organizational Culture of Inquiry for Lasting Transformation. Sebastian has spent years helping agile startups, Fortune 500 corporations, and government agencies move beyond dashboards and KPIs to something far more powerful: a mindset of curiosity, experimentation, and shared understanding. In this conversation, we'll explore why data initiatives fail, what leaders misunderstand about analytics, and how organizations can unlock the full potential of their people by embracing inquiry over certainty. And here's what makes Sebastian different from the usual data evangelists. He won't tell you that more data is the answer. In fact, he'll argue the opposite, that most organizations are getting data almost entirely wrong, and the fix has far less to do with technology than anyone wants to admit. If you've ever wondered why your data strategy isn't delivering, or how to build one that actually changes behavior, this episode is for you. Sebastian Wernicke, welcome to Leadership.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Now, you open your book with a striking line. You say, most data initiatives don't fail, they do something worse. They succeed at making your organization very good at staying the same. Tell us, what do you mean by that, and why is it such a dangerous trap?
Yeah, so what I found is that when a project completely blows up, everyone knows it failed, and you can just move on. And dangerous projects are those that quietly succeed on paper, but in the end, they change absolutely nothing about your company's trajectory. And that is what I see with data. With data, I see companies spend millions on new tools, but ultimately, the data just becomes a way to tweak the status quo. So if you're asking for a dashboard, what you will get is, of course, you will get a dashboard. That's not a kind of failure that you can see. But what that will do over time is you will optimize old processes and you will reinforce existing assumptions, all with a greater precision. And in a world of rapidly accelerating change, as we're seeing right now, just becoming highly efficient at staying the same isn't a victory. It's a slow motion risk, I would say.
So you draw a distinction between being data-driven and being data-inspired. Most leaders seem to be chasing data-driven. Why is that not enough? And what does the upgrade to data-inspired actually look like in practice?
So data-driven means that you systematically use data to measure and optimize what already exists. It's necessary, but it's purely incremental. And I think it's also very quickly just becoming the baseline expectations. So if you are still chasing data-driven, I think you have a lot of catching up to do. Now, even if you reach data-driven, you need an upgrade, I believe, to data-inspired. And that upgrade happens when you use data not just to measure and for assurance, but also to spark curiosity. So ask why and ask what if, and use data to discover what's possible. So one example I think that some people may already have heard about is Netflix, right? Where they, to handle original content, don't just use a purely data-driven algorithm that tells them, oh, people like a show that's exactly like this and that, and follow the past trends, but also use data to discover new shows that might be interesting to their viewers that they maybe even didn't know were interesting. So take, for example, a show that became very popular with Netflix, The Queen's Gambit. If you look into the data, I mean, you would basically say, oh, it's a historical drama. It's about chess. It's about addiction. Those all don't seem like trends, right? So if you just follow the data and you're data-driven, I think that's going to get you down a path of average. Whereas with data-inspired, what that's going to do is it will allow you to look at the outliers and allow you to look into the fringes of data to discover the next thing and to discover where your transformation should go.
Well, you describe a widespread state of data frustration, you call it. Companies investing heavily in data and AI, but not seeing transformative results. Why do you think this frustration persists so stubbornly?
I believe it persists because leaders are often trying to solve a cultural problem with software in the case of data. So there was a fascinating survey done in a European bank, and they asked their staff, are you data-driven? And everybody said yes, or most of them put their hands up, right? Sure. And then they asked, well, in the past month, have you changed your opinion based on data? And suddenly the hands start going down. Very few start saying yes. And then if you ask the third question where you say, when the data contradicts your manager, do you address that? And then you get silence. And I do that in many of the talks that I give as well. And it's always the same pattern. People think they're data-driven, but when it comes to changing minds, changing what you're doing something new, the hands go down. And so what that means is you can buy the most advanced AI on the market, the most advanced data tools, but if your day-to-day culture still revolves around hierarchy, gut feelings, office politics, essentially staying the same, then all of these data investments will fall completely flat. And that is where data frustration comes from.
Doesn't seem to be going away, even though we have so much talk about data these days.
It's history repeating, yes.
Old habits are hard to break, I suppose.
Yeah.
Well, you share the story of Joshua Bell playing his $3.5 million Stradivarius violin in a Washington, D.C. subway station, a virtuoso ignored by the rushing crowd in that station. What does that story illuminate about how most organizations have related to their data?
Yeah, so for anyone who doesn't know him, Joshua Bell is a classical superstar. People will pay hundreds of dollars to see him perform. But what happened when he was standing in the subway station with that expensive instrument, thousands of commuters literally just rushed right past him. And he collected, I think, $32 in the process. So he was standing there for quite a while, making a lot of noise. And I think for many years, that's exactly how companies treated their data. They had priceless insights that were flowing through the operations, but it was basically ignored. It was seen as technical noise that you would use from time to time. Now, these times are over. The problem has flipped. I think companies know that the virtuoso is playing. Maybe they recognize Joshua Bell, but that leads to another frustration because now they see the music, but they don't really know what to do with it, how to listen to it. So they expect that experience to magically transform them. They expect data to magically transform them. And then they don't really make any progress with that. And then we're back at data frustration.
So what do you see as the early warning signs that an organization is pretending to be data-driven but isn't really?
Yeah. So if you want to do a quick test, I think the 3 questions I mentioned earlier are really, really good and powerful diagnoses.
Sure.
The most glaring warning sign, I think, is when data is basically used as a rear view mirror only, and it's only used for justifying decisions that leadership essentially has already made, right? So you know where everything is going and you're trying to collect data to somehow justify that decision, or you're selectively using data to support that decision, and some other data gets kind of buried somewhere in a footnote or in another slide.
Sort of reminds me of a lot of the annual reports I read.
It's always in the footnotes, right?
Yeah, right. Here's what happened and here's why, and aren't we wonderful?
Yeah. Well, and that happens, more often, of course, than we would like if we look at it from the outside, but then looking at it from the inside, it may just be the culture that we have.
Right.
And that's, I think, the red flag. If you have an environment where data is never allowed to challenge the status quo or the boss's opinion. If data always conveniently agrees with the highest paid people in the room, you are not data driven. You're using spreadsheets for flattery, essentially.
Yeah. Well, you write about the dangers of what you call data theater. What does that look like on a day-to-day basis in an organization?
Data theater is an illusion of control. So day to day, what that looks like is you have incredibly complex dashboards, you have heavy investments in infrastructure, giving everybody a comforting feeling that they are on top of things, that they know what's going on. And on paper, or if you present that in a nice slide, the company will look completely cutting edge. But when you look at how decisions are actually made, especially when things get tough, or when that means that you have to walk back an opinion,
right?
Ideally one that you hold dearly and that you've stated publicly multiple times as a leader,
right.
Then you realize, well, the data is kind of ignored. And then it comes out, it's all a performance. You have the props, but the underlying habits and instincts remain entirely untouched.
So you have the choice between using data that informs or data that merely decorates.
Yeah. And some companies that claim they are data-driven, I think, would rather be accurately called data decorated in a way.
Well, let's step into some of those meetings of people in organizations. How do you design meetings that encourage inquiry rather than just reporting?
Yeah. So the way to diagnose that, I would say, is a reporting meeting is usually an exercise kind of in self-defense, whereas an inquiry meeting is an exercise in collaborative problem solving. So if you want to design for inquiry, you have to create a very open and non-confrontational environment. So Amazon, for example, does this brilliantly. They review hundreds of metrics, but they have a clear distinction between their steering metrics and their success metrics. So the ones that they discuss, that they use to steer the business, and the ones that they will measure people by. And what that leads to is that when they review all of these metrics, they can jointly focus on the actual problems. So they don't interrogate the employees over minor expected fluctuations, but instead they interrogate the problem and they dig deep. They do root cause analysis. They ask why repeatedly to drill down into understanding why is this happening, what we're seeing. And so in an inquiry meeting, I think you shift the energy from who is to blame, what's wrong, to what is that system of numbers trying to tell us?
It seems to me that it would be helpful if a leader in one of the early meetings got very explicit about expectations to create that kind of environment where people not only would feel safe in challenging the data and each other, but would realize that that mindset is what can really lead to success and the best use of data. Mm-hmm. You need to talk explicitly about what you expect in a meeting.
Yeah, and you need to, I think, as a leader, be not just inviting, you almost need to force people initially to be challenging, because that's just not the default in most cultures.
Right.
And I think a common mistake is to say, well, I value open discussion. I don't have anything against being challenged. Well, people will watch very closely whether that's actually true.
Right.
And the culture is, of course, not something that is on a poster in a hallway somewhere or on a PowerPoint slide. It's what people observe. So if you really want to establish that culture, it's not just the meeting. It's also who gets promoted, who gets hired, who gets let go. So if, the junior person that was just hired goes to the senior person and says, well, you've publicly declared we should do the product launch. I have some data here that tells us that's not a good idea. Does that lead to a rewarding career or to a conversation about how, quote unquote, helpful that hint about the data was?
Well, sure. And sometimes the best questions are asked by the newest person.
Yes.
And a lot of times those questions begin with the word why.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's inherent curiosity. And it's drilled out of people, unfortunately, oftentimes, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So you lay out 3 myths about data that most organizations unconsciously believe. The first is that data is objective. Why is this myth so seductive and so dangerous?
I think we all crave certainty and safety with everything that's going on. We desperately want data to be objective because we crave that clear, unquestionable truth. And data seems to be a very easy go-to for that. The unfortunate thing is that data is inherently subjective because data is created by humans, and humans make the rules about how to collect it. And so that's the dangerous part, that if we approach data and think it's an objective truth, then we overlook that human creation part. And that can lead to a lot of biases and unwanted effect. It can also lead to miscommunication. So one of the common things when it comes to data is people will complain in a large organization, oh, we have 5 different ways of measuring who's a customer or what's revenue to us. Mm-hmm. And if you think that data should be objective and there should only be a single truth, well, then that's annoying. But what actually happens in a large organization is, of course, humans create their own rules to measure what is relevant to them. And what's a customer is different to finance than it is to marketing, than it is to product management. And that's normal. And so believing that data is objective, I think, can lead to all of these misunderstandings down the line. And it also leads us to be way less critical of data than we should be.
Well, you argue that data interpretation is not unequivocal, that 2 people can look at the same data set and reach completely opposite yet equally defensible conclusions. How should leaders govern a culture where this is understood to be true?
I love that question. It's a great one. I think that the important part here is to treat conflicting interpretations as fuel and not as failure. So going back to the customer example, right? I could say, oh, we don't understand each other. Now we need to create a unified definition of customer here, and let's move on. And sometimes that might be useful, but I think the much more productive discussion, of course, is if you say, oh, that's interesting. Why are we talking about a customer in different ways? Why is it more important to define them in a certain way for one department as opposed to another department? So if 2 smart people reach the same conclusion from the same numbers, I think nobody will argue. That's also a problem. But if they reach opposite conclusions, then I think a weak leader, if you will demand to know who is right. And I think the data-inspired leader will then say, now, that's fascinating. What different assumptions are you both making? And you govern this culture by actively encouraging debate and rewarding that intellectual honesty. So you use the different facets to drive a richer, deeper strategic conversation rather than letting the numbers artificially force some unique conclusion that's probably not there.
Well, you could have 2 organizations with exactly the same data but different cultures.
Yes.
And they could have very different performance.
Absolutely. And I think that's what it comes down to. So one might just be following the numbers and in a culture of insecurity, and the other one will have the curious culture and try to see what is the data telling us that we're not seeing. Where
Right.
are we wrong? I think that's also a fundamental mindset shift behind the concept of being data inspired, to not say, I turn to the data to tell me where I'm right, and as a principle to tell me that everything's going okay, but rather saying, I want new questions from the data. I want to find out where we're not right, and not in a small optimizing sense, but in a larger transformative sense, to say, where in the data are the hints that our current business model might not be working next year? And how can we expose that today? How can we build a new strategy based on that? That's the mindset that's needed.
Your change initiative has the budget. The strategy looks solid, and everyone's nodding along in the meetings. But for some reason, it's going nowhere. Dr. Roger Dean Duncan knows why. After 40 years in the trenches with top business leaders, he knows that change fails when organizations lack the right foundations: trust, accountability, and real communication. Dr. Duncan's free 10-minute assessment shows you exactly where your organization stands. Answer a few straightforward questions that reveal your true change readiness level. Don't waste months discovering the hard way. Get your free assessment today at leadershop.net/change. Again, that's leadershop.net/change.
Well, I'm confident that not all of our listeners are necessarily the top leader in their organization. So what advice would you have for them when they're sitting at a table with some senior colleagues who disagree with them on their interpretation of the data? What are some ways that they can comfortably and convincingly persuade other people to look at a piece of data from a different angle?
Yeah, there's two tools that I found useful in that context. One tool is to just be very explicit about assumptions and constantly inviting the other people at the table to also state their assumptions. Ideally, if you enter this situation with the stark hierarchy contrast, of course, you've done your homework beforehand and sort of you know how that person is getting their data and you know what assumptions they are making so that you can actually clarify that. That, I think, is always a very useful tool. And of course, it requires a bit of receptiveness on the other side. So this is where I think the second tool comes in, which is to speak about data in the language of the person that you are talking to and not your own language. I think it's so tempting with data to think that if we just put the numbers on the table, they will automatically be convincing. And of course, oftentimes that's not the case.
Much, right.
Yeah, so find out what drives the other person and find out where your insight into data is going to help them. And don't try to use data to prove people wrong, because that will inherently fail.
Yeah.
So you need to do a bit of jujitsu there, but that is usually quite effective.
Yeah, I can imagine trying to look at the data from the perspective of the other person and then asking questions that might begin with, I wonder if. I wonder if we looked at it from this angle, I wonder if that might be even more helpful.
Yeah. Or it can also sometimes be, especially when technical people talk to leadership, as simple as, a technical person, when they find out something is true with a 66% probability,
right,
they will perceive that as precision. A decision maker will perceive that as uncertainty and saying, well, 66%, what am I going to do with that? Like, is it right or is it wrong? And 66 is not going to give me that. And then to change the language around that and say, for example, well, here's two scenarios where it works out, and this is what they look like. And here's one scenario where it doesn't work out, and this is what it looks like. And this is how we can distinguish the two. You've just described the 66% in a way that a decision maker can understand and process. And you have used your precision, but you've communicated it in a way that, as a decision maker, I can then decide what to do with it properly.
Yeah. Well, you describe confirmation bias as a fundamental operating principle of our cognition, not a quirk, but a feature. What does that mean for how organizations should design their decision-making processes?
Yeah. So confirmation bias, as well as literally dozens, more than 100 of other biases, are parts of how our brain works at a very deep level. So what that means is we can't just tell employees to be more objective. Our brains are literally wired to unconsciously go along these biases. So in the case of confirmation bias, to hunt for data that proves we are right and ignore data that proves we are wrong. And that is an operating principle of cognition. And as an organization, I must recognize that and then build mechanisms into my process against that. So in the case of confirmation bias, that would be to design friction into the decision-making process. So to build steps into a decision-making process where you very consciously address confirmation bias and say, are we wrong? Or even go farther and say, let's prove ourselves wrong. Let's find data that shows we are not right. And you do that conscious mindset shift just to get out of that bias. And there's a couple of important biases, again, confirmation bias being one of them, where I think these friction steps, where you very consciously address the bias, are what protects you from going into the brain's default mode on your decisions.
It seems to me that if a team was willing to adopt the practice you just described, and they had success with it, and I think they would, that over time that would become sort of almost their default behavior. They would see that it works, and they would be much more willing automatically to challenge data in a way that they did not in the past.
Yeah, it would become part of their identity. They would at some point say, this is how we do things here. And then you've changed the culture.
Sure. Well, now you talk about the chief data officer role and the fact that CDO tenure is alarmingly short. What are chief data officers typically doing wrong, and what would a truly effective one do differently?
Yeah, and I mean, there's not just the chief data officers these days, right? People are now trying to slide AI into that. So we have very unwieldy acronyms emerging.
Yeah, I know, it's out of control.
Yeah. I mean, of course, some CDOs are doing things wrong, but I think they're also not always set up for success. And that is the systemic problem. So they are put into a position where what is expected of them is to drive transformation across the business. But the way that the role is usually set up, it's more of a technical role. So if you look at the responsibilities of a chief data officer, or you hear them described, most of the time it's, well, data governance, it's making sure we have all the data. Maybe there's an interface to IT. Even that can be a bit full of friction, right? Because IT then has to organize data in a way that the chief data officer wants them to. But what rarely comes up on top is this expectation. Well, as a chief data officer, we are expecting you to transform how we make decisions here. And ultimately, that also means we expect you to transform how we do business. And I think if they are caught in this situation where the expectation is transformation, the whole setup, including who they report to, the budget, the team size, is all set up for rather operational tasks, then they are not set up for success. Now, the CDOs that are still successful, I think, are extremely, extremely great leaders and just amazing individuals that despite the setup, despite the resources, they manage to connect with their C-level peers at eye-to-eye level. They manage, the soft power, getting things done and so on. But it very much depends on the individual. And so those that fail, I wouldn't say that they're necessarily doing things wrong. It's just that they have been given a very, very difficult setup most of the time.
Sure. Well, the best leaders, in my view, have always been those who are willing to be challenged. In fact, they like to be challenged because they know that helps them be more effective and the people around them be more effective. Mm-hmm. If you've got 10 smart people around the table and they agree on everything, you probably have the wrong 10 smart people.
Which you hired, so you might also have done something wrong there yourself.
Exactly.
Right?
Well, now, Sebastian, you take on the famous misquote attributed to Peter Drucker. What gets measured gets managed. And you argue that it's been used to justify exactly the kind of metric obsession that Deming, who actually said something like it, was warning against. What went wrong in how organizations absorbed this idea?
Yeah. So, I mean, Peter Drucker will be known to every listener here, I assume.
Yeah.
Deming, maybe not always. So W. Edwards Deming is the inventor or pioneer of data-driven process control. So something that tells you, I think, a little bit about how he thought about data. So he thought data was the ideal way to improve processes and to control them. And so this quote, which Drucker never said, what gets measured gets managed, is often attributed to Deming. Now, the irony here is that it's one of the most blatant cases of a misquote, because what Deming actually said was that it's wrong to assume that what gets measured gets managed. And he was so convinced of that he put management purely by numbers on his list of 7 deadly sins of management in the end. And that, I think, is just so amazing. First of all, that the inventor of statistical process control ultimately comes to the realization, don't steer everything by numbers. It's wrong, right? Even he. And if someone like Deming says that, who are we to disagree with him, I think?
Yeah.
Now, if we follow it, and you've also seen it, it comes on countless slides and people use it everywhere. The thing is, I think there's 2 things that go wrong if we believe that what gets measured gets managed. The first one is that we need to measure everything. Otherwise, it doesn't get managed. So I've seen this obsession, where in discussions, we will set a goal and then somebody will say, well, if we can't quantify the goal, then it's not a real goal. It needs we need to have these smart metrics and so on. And I think that's a fallacy, because of course you can have very good goals that you just can't measure just because data can't see them. And of course, the other thing that goes wrong with that is this pure focus on metrics, so that if you believe I am managing the numbers, that you then believe you're also managing the business. And the two are very, very different things.
Yes. Well, you distinguish between steering metrics and success metrics. If you would, walk us through that distinction and why the two are so confusing and so costly.
Yeah. So success metrics are numbers that measure the past, or measure whether you've done the right things in the past. So this will be things like profit and revenue. They are the ultimate score in the end of whether your decisions were good and whether you executed well on them, but you cannot directly control them. And steering metrics, on the other hand, are actionable, controllable inputs that you can manage right now. So as a salesperson, for example, how many people am I going to call today? How many prospects am I going to visit this quarter? So something that you can immediately do today that you hope will lead to success ultimately, and it's measurable right now, but you don't know if it's going to lead to success. Now, if you confuse steering and success, then it triggers something known as Goodhart's law, which states that when a measure becomes a target, it stops being a good measure. Classic example is General Electric. They did this for years. They steered the entire organization towards hitting very specific, stable profit targets. And they hit the success metrics, but it masked massive and systemic problems in the core business underneath. But because they used that success metric to steer the business, everybody was just incentivized to hit the targets no matter what. And well, you can sometimes call this gaming the system, but I think it's more a fundamental misalignment of incentives that happens once you do that. So the organizations that are successful with data, they draw a very clear distinction. They say, in our daily discussions, let's focus on the steering metrics that we can control today. And if we do that right, then we have a high chance of hitting our success metrics once we look back in a year from now or in a quarter from now.
Well, you say that the hype around artificial intelligence often causes organizations to skip the foundational work, the data literacy, the cultural infrastructure, the decision frameworks that would actually let AI deliver. What do you see as the right sequencing?
Yeah, I can understand that everybody wants to jump straight to the shiny AI tools. They are beautiful. And it's another case, of course, of history repeating in a way that when analytics came around, everybody wanted to have analytics. When big data, if anybody even remembers the term came around. Everybody wanted to do big data or digitalization. But what happens is if you drop an advanced technology into a company that is not prepared for it, that has not prepared the culture, that has not prepared the strategy for it, and that also hasn't identified the purpose of why you are dropping in this technology, then usually you will end up in frustration. So the same way that I talk about data frustration, I think we will be talking about AI frustration very soon. So the right sequence, in my mind, is always culture first, tool second, or purpose first, tool second, or strategy first, tool second. You should get these three things figured out. That doesn't mean, of course, that you shouldn't be starting to work on AI, but you need to initiate the fundamentals alongside that. Otherwise, you don't have things like a baseline AI literacy. You don't have a mindset that embraces the change that is about to come. And you don't have a culture that will reward the use of that new technology, because employees will still be entrenched in the old incentive habits or incentive schemes that you've built. So don't think that a new software tool, and even AI, is magic, but it will not magically fix your decision making or the culture. It's like, I always like to say, it's a bit like, when you get a fitness app on your iPhone, that will not build muscle. You need to think a bit about your broader goals before you do that.
Yeah, always gets back to the people issue.
Yeah, it was people all along.
Sure. No big secret there.
Well, it's not a secret, but it's still something that keeps repeating. I think that's that's the mystery of it. If you look at surveys that ask executive, why do you think that you're not achieving transformative results with your data? It's always the same three reasons. They say, well, we're not sure we have the skills. We're not sure that we can put enough attention onto it. And we're not entirely sure about the business case. And that is the same three answers in surveys that you see 15 years ago when we were talking about analytics, 5 years ago when we were talking about digital and machine learning, and that you see in current AI surveys. It doesn't change. And of course, all of these three things ultimately are people issues.
Sure.
So we need to finally tackle that.
It's going to be interesting what we're seeing 5 years from now. It seems like the world is moving faster all the time.
Oh my God, yes.
Well, now, you argue that becoming data-inspired is not about building a smarter organization. It's about building a more curious one. Why do you think curiosity is the better North Star than intelligence or efficiency?
I think that curiosity invites us to explore the next thing. And as you say, and I would fully agree, the world is changing extremely fast. And it's not just AI where we're seeing that. I mean, we are seeing geopolitical situations that are very difficult. We see supply chains crumble every day. We have other large-scale problems like climate change, aging populations, and so on. So the pace of change is not going to go down. If anything, it's just going to accelerate, is what I believe. And so if you're smart and efficient, I think that is very good for operating in a stable environment. And it also means that, whenever you change the business, of course, you have to do that in a smart and efficient way. So I'm not arguing against that. Let's be dumb and inefficient. I think that would not be a recipe for success in the end. But you need curiosity to constantly be on the lookout for how do we need to change the business in order to thrive a year from now or 2 years from now. So the same discussions that you would have had a couple of years ago, you would say, let's look 5 years out, 10 years out. That time frame is shortening rapidly. And curiosity, to me, is the fundamental solution to deal with that. And now, when it comes to data inspired, of course, that means not just gut feelings. What do we believe? What have I read on the blogs and in the papers? It's a curiosity that is grounded in evidence. And I think that is the successful recipe, to look into data, look into evidence and say, what is this telling us? Where are the next signals? And then use that to prepare yourself for what's coming in a couple of months these days.
Sure. Well, final question here. In the next decade, what skills will leaders need that many of them don't have today? Specific skills.
I will point out one skill that I think, because I think a lot of skills also still remain. Your skill to convince others, your skill to build alliances across functions, your skill to motivate and engage people. I think those things are here to stay around. I am a strong believer.
Sure, and skill to listen.
Skill to listen, yes. And hopefully a bit more skill to have inquiry and curiosity.
Right.
But I think one of the critical skills prompted by everything that's happening in AI is the skill to do critical validation. AI models, as I think we have all seen, are incredibly articulate, but the fundamental mechanism that they still operate on is statistical probabilities. There's no understanding underneath. And so AI can generate these answers that sound beautifully authoritative and yet can be either banal or irrelevant or incorrect. So the whole hallucination topic. And I think a human edge will be to be able to recognize what of all the information I'm getting passes that test. What of that is really relevant versus what's all the noise that sounds good but doesn't really contain any signal. And I think that's becoming more and more difficult by the day. And leaders, of course, in order to guide their organizations, will always have to maintain a clear view on that.
A lot of success now and in the future is about mindset. How you look at the world, how you look at data, of course, how you look at opportunity.
Yeah.
Well, Sebastian Wernicke, thank you so much for joining us on Leadership. I want to close with something Sebastian wrote near the end of his book that I keep coming back to. He said, data-driven organizations optimize what exists. Data-inspired organizations discover what's possible. For the leaders in our audience, people who are genuinely trying to build something that lasts, that's not just a line about data. That's a call to a different kind of leadership altogether. One that asks harder questions, tolerates more uncertainty, invests in a culture before it invests in tools, and trusts that the work of building inquiry into the DNA of an organization is in fact the work that matters. To learn more about Sebastian and his work, go to datainspired.org. Share this episode with your friends and associates. Be sure to leave a review of our podcast. Even a single sentence fuels the algorithms that promote the great content that the Leadership podcast provides. And for free resources to help in your leadership journey, go to leadership.net. That's leadership.net. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time, stay safe, be happy, and spread good cheer wherever you go. For Leadership, I'm Roger Dean Duncan.